On this episode of China Unscripted, China is building a wartime economy, and China's takeover of Hong Kong is just one step in the Communist Party's imperialism. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And joining us today is Max Mok, a Hong Kong activist based in Australia. Thanks for joining us, Max.
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, the national security law has obviously affected the democracy movement in Hong Kong. What has been the change that's happened?
Well, I think it's forced the pro-democracy movement to change its ways of conducting itself, both domestically in Hong Kong and in overseas as well. So, firstly, there are two phenomena that we're seeing now. The first one being there's a large number of exiled activists, and along that, even families and people that aren't so political themselves. We're talking mothers and fathers, children and kids. They are all moving overseas. And so what we get now here is that the majority opinion, the majority of Hong Kong, or where the opinion lies, is now overseas and not domestically in Hong Kong. That means two things to me. The first thing is that elections in Hong Kong will no longer mean anything. Before, in the past 2 years of our pro-democratic movement, we've seen attempts to take over the Legislative Council by getting loads of pro-democracy legislators in. The national security law proved that that path wouldn't work. And then for district councils as well, we're now seeing possibilities of these district councillors that are pro-democracy being cleared out by the Chinese state. And we're also seeing mandatory feds, as you have covered on your show before. China is now demanding that Hong Kong politicians in general be patriotic and loyal to the Chinese Communist Party before they can take up their roles. So with that and the elections no longer being a good reflection of the majority will of the Hong Kong people, it is now more important than ever that those that are exiled, the families that have gone overseas, to organize ourselves again. And we're going much, in my personal view, we're going a path very similar to the Tibetans and to the Uyghurs as well of the world. In that we have now lost our home base, our homeland, and now we have to reorganize in our new homes outside of home.
So the national security law wasn't just a way to stop the protest. It seems like it was a way for the Communist Party to force everyone who was in Hong Kong that had pro-democracy or pro-independence leanings, they all have to leave Hong Kong now, essentially, meaning the only ones left are people who will toe the party line.
Well, the Communist Party and the Hong Kong government has never been lenient on the views of independence and self-determination. Even before, right after 2014, when the Hong Kong National Party was founded and the localist movement in Hong Kong first started, that is more pro-independence leaning, they have never been able to rest, and the government has always been, public opinion has always been quite harsh on them. So national security law just sets it in stone that we can't have that sort of thought in Hong Kong. But I feel like the atmosphere and the environment has always been quite hostile to it. The only good thing, though, I feel is, and this might sound psychopathic to say this, but if anything, the national security law proves to the Hong Kong people that there can be no centrist way of dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. There can be no median way where we can just coexist with the party and try to tote their line and try to play by their books. I mean, if anything, the past 20-some years have proved that that doesn't work. And national security law just tells us that it won't work. And not before and not again, and never will. And it brings to the public, the Hong Kong public, that independence or some sort of self-determination, to put it into better terms, I feel, the ability of the Hong Kong people to be able to reflect themselves in a democratic election or in some sort of sovereign political entity aside from Chinese Communist Party. That is the only way forward, I feel.
Yeah, I remember when we were in Hong Kong for the umbrella movement in 2014. At the time, the idea of Hong Kong independence was sort of seen as something kind of on the extreme side of things. Most people just were protesting for democracy, things the Communist Party had actually promised to the people of Hong Kong. But it seems like at this point, even those reasonable demands no longer will work. The Communist Party has forced the people of Hong Kong into an extreme position.
Yes, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. That actually is a huge concern of mine. Obviously, I wasn't born in time for the handover and the transition of sovereignty. I was born in 2000. I'm now 20. So I missed a lot of major historical events. But for the longest time in Hong Kong, the public consensus was that at least around 2014, around myself, my close circle of friends and family, was that nobody liked the Chinese Communist Party, even for the blue ribbons or pro-establishment supporters in Hong Kong right now. Even back then, I think it's pretty safe to say that nobody ever liked the idea of Hong Kong being fully a part of the Chinese Communist Party. But it's never put into words and it's never put into action. And after that, very conveniently, the pan-democratic camp in Hong Kong offered an easy solution, right? So vote for the pan-democrats, vote for these sort of certain parties that will reflect your voices in Parliament and in the Legislative Council, and your problems will be solved, and we will push us towards a path towards democracy. Well, that is a very nice promise, and it's a promise given to us for 20 years, and nothing has ever come of it. And I feel the rhetoric that we are working towards human rights and freedom in the way that we don't really know how we're going to achieve it. There's a very lacking debate and lacking discussion before 2014 and before this sort of political rhetoric is brought up to the public minds. So I feel the Hong Kong masses were very pacified by institutionalized politics back then after the handover. Certainly, during the umbrella movement, like you said, Hong Kong independence was seen as more radical, and it's not very widely accepted. If anything, the results, the things that the Chinese Communist Party has done to us, have showed us that the reason is quite simple. You cannot trust a treaty with China or the Chinese Communist Party. You cannot trust a treaty with the Chinese Communist Party. And under that, no matter how many basic laws or how many respects of sovereignty they write up to us, none of that is going to matter, because at the end of the day, we lack the power of enforcement, right? Britain hasn't done anything. The UK hasn't done anything aside from the BNO visas and letting some of the BNO visa holders back into the UK. Well, aside from that, they haven't actually held China to their word, I feel. And that lack of enforcement is the underlying problem with all sorts of treaties that dealt with China. The stuff back then doesn't work now yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for people to learn their lesson. I remember last year I was talking with this is before the Hong Kong national security law. I was talking with a Tibetan activist in New York, and he was saying, back in 1959, Tibet, had signed, before 1959, Tibet had signed the 11-point agreement with the Communist Party to allow Tibet to be part of China, but it would still have autonomy, which is why it's called the, Tibet Autonomous Region. And within a few years, the Communist Party completely broke that agreement. But essentially, that was the same type of agreement as the one that the Communist Party had with Great Britain over Hong Kong. And so he's like what you should have done is seen what's happened in Tibet. And within a few years, the Dalai Lama had to flee, right? And he's like, that's probably going to happen to Hong Kong. And at the time, because this was January 2020, it wasn't fully clear just how bad things were going to go. But it turned out, of course, the lesson from Tibet from, half a century earlier was, unfortunately, the lesson that had to be learned. Once again, I bring this up because one of the things that you're doing is working with other groups, as you mentioned, to sort of a solidarity standing up to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, thank you. So the reason for that is firstly, definitely, we need to learn from our predecessors. And our Tibetan brothers and sisters, their struggle is very similar to ours, and especially how they have conducted and managed to organize their communities overseas, and even getting parliament in exile, stuff like that. We really have to learn from, or that sort of organizing power. But even beyond that, the Uyghurs now, they're facing a very great threat, more so than any other ethnic minority that comes to mind in recent days have occurred in China. They also have very large diaspora communities overseas. And primarily the thing that I'm doing right now is to organize our people that have already been naturalized in new homes. So what that means is we've tried to talk to politicians to raise concern for our causes, but it sometimes really does feel like we are begging without any chips on our side. Right, on humanitarian grounds, we're trying to get them to sympathize with us, which does work because a lot of these countries like Australia, where I'm at right now, they're quite sympathetic and they do value human rights. But at some certain point when economic interests and other interests come into play, their ability to do things are quite restricted. So to organize our votes, since we're nationalized, we have citizenship and we have the right to vote. To use, when we say, like the Hongkongers back in our protest days, we used to say whatever the cost, right? So whatever the cost doesn't just mean giving up your lives, which is noble, I think, to be able to give up your lives for that. But and I respect that. But there needs to be a lot more under the umbrella of whatever the costs. And one of those things I feel, and a lot of my friends feel as well here in Australia, is that it also means making use of every bit of civil liberties that we have here in Australia and using our civil rights to the fullest extent to get our diaspora voices heard. And with the votes, we will tell the Parliament of Australia, we'll tell the parliaments of the world that the sympathizers with those human rights abuses will not be tolerated in our parliaments, and we will show them with our votes that they will not be staying there long.
Well, isn't that going to be challenging? Because Australia is a perfect example of this. The Chinese Communist Party has huge influence operations in Australia, particularly in Parliament. How do you deal with the Communist Party having this kind of global reach?
Very much so. Thank you. I have been in Australia for a couple of years now, although I have been back in Hong Kong, back and forth for the past 2 years. And the infiltration can really be felt on all sorts of levels. On university campuses, when the early protest days first started, I mean, we get Chinese Communist Party sympathizers, those teenagers at school, they terrorize and then they send threat messages to students that they speak up as a Hong Konger, or to students that would use Hong Kong as a cultural, as an example in their projects, as a culturally distinct entity from China. So whatever thing that pisses them off, they will bash you on uni campuses and they'll get away scot-free. And Australia, fortunately enough, has started an inquiry into infiltration on university ground. And I feel like the country is on a right track in terms of those policies in combating infiltration locally. But definitely, like you said, in political parties in Australia and in industry in Australia, on every facet of life, we don't mean to make an enemy out of the Chinese people, obviously. We vary in cultures and we vary in political opinions. But a lot of these Chinese Communist Party agents and infiltrators, they've gotten themselves into the mix, and using the leniency and using the more passive way that the Australian government's been taking against China, their roots have taken quite deeply. But I feel like the policies are in line to combat that now. And I feel like if our diaspora communities and more interest communities do speak up and we do call out these events when they happen so that the government can act accordingly, I feel like that will help a bit.
Is there a large Hong Kong diaspora in Australia?
Definitely, yeah. And it's only growing, right? Even before 2019, I've spoken to a lot of immigrants since the 2000s, and because they come to our events and they come to protest as well. It's been growing since 2014. A lot of people have the foresight that the national security law or something as evil was going to come for Hong Kong. So quite a bit of people left back then. And in past, even further before, past events in Hong Kong have drove a lot of people, of Hong Kong immigrants into Australia. And after 2019, we have yet to see a huge refugee level upsurge, but the number is definitely growing. And we are seeing a lot in Hong Kong's social media sphere as well, more and more information on immigrating to Australia and other Western countries like Canada and the US has been growing. And the diaspora community is only getting bigger.
Was it Ted Hui, the former lawmaker who recently moved to Australia?
Oh, yes. Yes, it is.
Okay, so you're getting some, because I think a lot of people think of the UK as a big kind of hub for Hong Kong diaspora and activism. Nathan Law is there. The UK they just opened a fund to help Hong Kongers immigrate to the UK. But I think we don't necessarily think about some of these other Commonwealth countries like Australia and Canada as having the political power that they actually do.
Yes. So that brings me to another point as well. The work that I would like to do here in Australia and an interest of mine is to tell basically the world, the local government here in Australia and Hong Kongers as well, that it doesn't have to be a handout. And so the way I'm trying to frame this is Australia itself is lacking in labor force. And we can really use a lot of skilled labor, and we can use skilled immigrants from Hong Kong as well. And this is something that Hong Kong has to offer. And the stimulus that the upsurge of Hong Kong immigrants into Australia, we need to think about how we can benefit the economy and the community here domestically as well before we pitch this sort of rescue, safe haven plans. And Australia has put out the 5-year plan, a 5-year transition plan for students, Hong Kong students here in Australia to transition into permanent residence. But that's not quite working because leaving lots of people that don't necessarily have the capital for that or don't necessarily have the skill set for those specifically required skill sets that the Australian government is looking for to make it happen. So, I think we need for Australia definitely doesn't have as much resources, I feel, politically speaking as well, because we are much more dependent on China economically and geographically as well. We can't really just on the go and put out a huge plan to get thousands or tens of thousands of Hong Kongers in. But we need to encourage that debate, and we need to show the Australian government and the domestic community that we're not here to take things over. We're here to assist and we're here to help.
So speaking of Hong Kongers trying to emigrate from Hong Kong, the city has about 7.5 million people. How many Hong Kongers do you think would want to leave Hong Kong and settle in other countries if they could?
Well, I think the numbers may vary, but I think I'm definitely not an expert on those numbers. And I think even if we did a survey, the numbers would be quite muddled because in the 7 million people, a lot of them are pro-establishment, I feel. Well, a good number of them are pro-establishment. And then also on top of that, we'll get, back in the localist era or a couple of years earlier, Hong Kong has seen a large upsurge of mainland Chinese immigrants into Hong Kong. Is it the will of the Hong Kong people that identifies as a Hong Konger to leave Hong Kong? Or is it the mainland Chinese immigrants that have always been trying to get out of China? Is it their will to get out of Hong Kong? So, the demographics are really mixed and it's a bit hard to say.
I think one thing that's interesting about what you said, Max, about the idea of changing the way that you talk about Hong Kongers coming to Australia or different places as not asking for a handout, but making a contribution. What's interesting about that is when we were in Australia in 2018, I remember there was a lot of antipathy towards a lot of the mainland Chinese coming to Australia, but a lot of that was because a lot of the people were kind of quite wealthy and buying houses to kind of as somewhere to park their money, but they actually wouldn't live in Australia. They were, kind of like buying these houses, like driving up the real estate market so that, people couldn't buy houses to actually live in. And they were, trying to get citizenship, a place to kind of like get their money out of China. And I think there was definitely that idea that, Australians they don't like the Chinese coming in. That could be seen in a very negative way. But what's interesting from what you're saying is, we're here to make a contribution. Like this is going to be our home, and I think that's something that would be much more welcome.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of the times, well, I'm not saying. So first of all, just as a disclaimer, because this is quite a bit of a sensitive topic, is that I'm not denying that there is Asian racism or racism against Asians in Australia and in other Western countries as well. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I do think that it's real and it's living, and it's a problem that we need to address. But on the other side of the coin is that that sort of sentimentality. We have to separate sentiments from the facts, and a lot of times China would like to, the Chinese Communist Party would like to play to those sentiments, and they try to amplify it and amplify the results that the consequences that it indicates in order to scare a lot of more progressive people into refraining from criticizing the Chinese Communist Party. And we need to get past that. Like you said, immigration was never the problem. It is the respect for the local community and the contribution to the local community that is the problem. And that is the thing that we need to address as immigrants. The Chinese Communist Party and a lot of their larger corporations, they've been buying up strategic resources, and they've been, like I said, buying up real estate and driving up the real estate market prices. But that's only perfect. The core of the problem is that these investors and these Chinese communist agents in Australia, they are not acting with the interest of Australia in mind, and they are acting with China and the People's Republic of China, acting with that regime's interest in mind. And when Australian land and Australian resources are put to work, the value isn't going back into the local economy that the government would have expected, or that the community would have expected. It's sucked out, and then it's gone into other sources and channels back into the mainland Chinese economy and mainland Chinese regime as sustenance. And that, at the end of the day, is the problem. If an immigrant starts a business here and then it contributes them into the local economy, as I think that most Hong Kongers would do if we do get the chance to come to Australia, I don't think that would be a problem.
Well, so something you mentioned earlier, that I think is very important as an example that Hong Kong has for the rest of the world. The Communist Party did not keep its promise with Hong Kong. And yet, Hong Kong should be an example for the rest of the world. We should see how the Chinese Communist Party does not value what it promises. And yet we still have Australia's a good example. Around the world, governments and especially corporations still eager to get into China, to work with the Chinese Communist Party, completely oblivious to the very real history of it, ignoring promises in the cases of corporations, stealing intellectual property and running businesses out of the country. So Hong Kong, I think, plays a very important model. Hong Kong is a good example for the rest of the world that the rest of the world should learn from. But it still seems like people have this sort of blinders on when dealing with the Chinese Communist Party.
Right, yeah, definitely. Well, they're trying to pitch the same, very similar plan to the Taiwanese as well. And I'm just grateful to see that it's not going through anytime soon. Yes, there is a tendency for the wider community to ignore lessons from history. And a lot of the times, there's some sort of exceptionalism, I feel, from all sorts of different countries and cultures when it comes to dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. Well, here in Australia as well, I didn't quite know what was going through the Premier's mind, but Victoria, the state of Victoria, almost went into a Belt and Road Agreement to have Chinese capital and Chinese Communist Party act in Victoria and act with Victoria's government. And it was only when it went to a federal level when it was turned down. I don't know where quite the problem is, but it doesn't take a history lesson or history class. We just have to look to our neighbors at this point, right?
It does seem like there's a little bit of that, like, well, it has to happen to you before you kind of realize what's happening. Do you feel like over the summer, Australia, basically China launched essentially a type of like economic warfare against the Australian government? We're trying to block Australian imports, all this kind of stuff. Have you seen a change in Australia in the attitude towards the Chinese Communist Party since that started happening?
I would say certain members or certain politicians have. It's definitely not a consensus. It definitely isn't where we want it yet. I mean, just a couple of months ago, an Australian professor working right now in the Chinese mainland, writing an article on me and on the ABC, condemning us or condemning the ABC for terrorism and aiding and abetting terrorism, basically along those lines. I mean, when scholars are allowed to do that, when Australian scholars are actively doing that in Australia and abroad, and politicians as well, when they're still trying to ignore the basic fact that what's happening in Xinjiang province right now, or occupied East Turkestan right now, is a genocide, and would use different trickery of words to get around saying it, like cultural genocide or atrocities, stuff like that. When they can't really, when they are fearing just condemning a genocide, I think we've still quite some ways to go.
But by the way, congratulations on being slandered by the Chinese Communist Party and the people they're linked to, because that means that you're doing something that they fear, which means it's something important. So good job on that.
I thank you. I wear it like a badge of honor every day. Yeah.
So what do you think is the Communist Party's next move in Hong Kong? For instance, we don't see the Great Firewall of China activated in Hong Kong yet.
Well, at this point, it's all speculation. But one thing that I don't hope to see, let's start with that. Yep. Definitely, politically speaking, I don't think much actions can be done now, at least not conventional politics. Not in the parliament, not in the legislative council, not in the district councils as well, because they're now being vetted, and now they're under so much scrutiny. They're under so much monitoring from the Chinese Communist Party. That basically one campaign material that signals at democracy can get them jailed and get families torn apart. I really do commend and I have the deepest respect for all the participants of the primary elections that were arrested and are now behind bars and under trial in Hong Kong. That said, going forward, I don't think much things can be done politically. The thing that I fear most now that the Chinese Communist Party does is that they will then crack down on even more intangible things other than politics. They'll start cracking down on culture, and they'll start cracking down on language, which is two things that they have done before in different regions of China that they have occupied. And it's definitely the road that we're headed if we do take those models into reference.
So you think they're going to get rid of Cantonese and get rid of traditional characters and replace it all with, Mandarin from the mainland?
Well, yeah. Language, definitely. Well, they have done this. They've tried doing this so many times before. It's only that we have withheld against it again and again. I mean, even before 2016 and in the early years, the National Education Bill, they tried to push through to change our Chinese history into state-approved Chinese history. And then they tried to push for this curriculum. They tried to push for the Chinese language curriculum in Hong Kong to adopt Mandarin as the language of use, other than Cantonese. And they have done so much propaganda on how Mandarin is supposed to be better than Cantonese and stuff like that. And even in neighboring Guangzhou, inside their own jurisdiction and sovereignty, they have cracked down on their own ethnic Cantonese language. So language is definitely one of the first to go, I argue. Yes.
What is the culture that you're talking about that you're afraid that could be endangered?
Well, thank you again. It's really good segues today. Since the crackdown in the political activities of Hong Kong, after the persisting movement that started at June 9, a lot of people that really do love Hong Kong have brought the movement into their lives and brought it in separate ways. So in really recently this year especially, there's been an upsurge of local artists and local musicians, and a lot of money is put into the arts here locally by people who do love Hong Kong and do want to put Hong Kong under the spotlight. Will the mentioning of Hong Kong as a unique identity or unique culture be outlawed as well? I mean, that is certainly something that the Chinese Communist Party can do and will do, as if it is anything that we know. On top of that, made in Hong Kong, a lot of initiatives have been taken to support local produce and local industry to revive the economy locally, to actually manufacture, other than relying on the economy that is more finance-based. So just to make Hong Kong more than just a money laundering machine for the Chinese Communist Party, and to make it into an actual living and breathing city. Lots of that work has been done. Lots of industry has been revived and is reviving. I fear for the day where made in Hong Kong has become outlawed, and the label itself can be evidence for violation of the national security law. I really don't want to see that happen, but I do see it happening.
Imagine if those like "I love New York" shirts were taken as like an example of like you're being against the U.S. if you say you love New York.
Yeah, well, remember, you probably saw this, Max, the movie 10 Years by Andrew Choi. Not the one with Channing Tatum, but the one about Hong Kong. And there's the whole, like, one of the short films within that was like the vendor wanted to sell eggs labeled as local eggs, and that became a problem because it was seen as like somehow pro Hong Kong being a separate entity. And it's like what you're saying. It's almost like that prediction is like just about to come true.
Yes, basically everything that was supposed to be happening in 10 years, as the filmmakers had predicted, the agenda's been pushed forward. And the actors actually the actor for that part of the short film who played the vendor, he just died, and he himself has been a great advocate for the Hong Kong arts. Also, the part about how taxi drivers are no longer allowed to speak Cantonese and are now then mandated to speak Mandarin. Stuff like that, we do see it happening. And I think it's just a logical next step for the Chinese Communist Party to take, given their past records.
It is a type of cultural genocide that the Communist Party has used in Tibet, Mongolia, East Turkestan.
Yes. Cultural genocide is definitely agreed on, I feel. But, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language thing is a lot of people outside China don't have this full grasp of all the different Chinese dialects. But what's happened, as I see it, is that the Communist Party has not only enforced Mandarin, but has enforced a kind of party speak Mandarin that involves words taking on certain connotations that are aligned with the Communist Party's values, simplified characters, which are, some of them have their meanings reduced or removed after having been simplified from the traditional characters. And so you kind of have this partly bastardized version of Mandarin. And then when you don't allow people to speak Cantonese or Uyghur or Tibetan or any of the other ethnic languages, like there are certain things that just don't translate into modern Mandarin. And so a lot of the concepts, a lot of the like like deeper ideas and meanings behind words no longer exist because the languages in which they exist have been marginalized. And so it actually changes people's thinking when they're forced to speak only the Communist Party's Mandarin.
Yes, I really do agree with that point where you say it's not just the language that they're forcing upon us. It's also the culture behind it and the new speak, the double speak, the version of Mandarin that the Chinese Communist Party has approved of. And even in Hong Kong right now, even if it hasn't been mandated yet, in slogans and in company slogans and in banners everywhere, we see it happening. 18 characters, really short and succinct, things that are overly dramatic and overly blown up when it comes to stuff like loyalty. Certain values that the Chinese Communist Party would really expect from their subjects. Those sort of banners are up everywhere and in virtually a lot of marketing here in Hong Kong. I mean, before I left, I've already seen it. The city is no longer what I used to know. Even without the full-blown cultural genocide happening in Hong Kong.
The propaganda slogans.
Yeah, once you see those, that's in mainland China, it's like they're actually all over the place, even though it's a little less obvious now than it might have been during the Cultural Revolution. But you see them on billboards, you see them on
just banners.
I remember in Beijing seeing like on the side of a delivery truck, it was like, taxation is the lifeblood of our country. Honest taxpayers are of great credit to the nation and the people. Like, but it was all this like propaganda slogan that was like, it just kind of permeated the whole country in this kind of weird and subtle way that just always made me a little bit uncomfortable, like at some level I couldn't quite describe.
Yes, it's almost like the party is omniscient in every aspect of daily life, and it's really quite haunting. And I didn't expect to see it in my lifetime in Hong Kong, but it has happened, and it is happening, and it will continue to happen.
Well, so that's a good point. People definitely had grim predictions of what the Chinese Communist Party would do to Hong Kong, but I think it was a surprise to many how quickly it happened. It really accelerated over the past couple of years. Why do you think the Chinese Communist Party suddenly felt like it had to rein in Hong Kong?
Right. Thank you. A couple of things I feel, and this might be somewhat of a hot take, but I feel like Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is the worst manifestation of a very long-standing problem of the Chinese Communist Party and of the culture behind it. The term that I would like to use is Chinese imperialism. And when we talk about imperialism, it's always about colonization, colonization in the age of discovery, as we know it. But what we often ignore is the Heaven's Mandate and the Chinese version of its own imperialism. For thousands of years, they have done this. I mean, it comes, and it should come as no surprise. The assimilation and forced assimilation and the homogenizing of cultures has been the way of expansion for its culture, for the Han sphere. And in all throughout Chinese history, it's happened. And it's just that what's happening to Hong Kong now, East Turkestan and Tibet before, is in a modern context. But the largest standing problem is that they feel a need to rule and they feel a need to dominate. And this sort of problem is manifested in Xi Jinping in more so than anybody else. We see that Xi Jinping right now, he's not building a country, or he's not trying to get the country into a path of prosperity. He's trying to build an empire, and that is exactly what he's doing. The island chains that China Unscripted have covered so many times before, like the Philippines and stuff like that, in the South China Sea and the Nine Dash Line, all sorts of aggression, it's outwards, right? They're oppressing people internally, and at the same time, they're expanding outward. The intolerance for diversity within their borders or within their sort of cultural sphere, well, they will only allow certain token minorities to exist. Like the Chinese state propaganda, there was a very disgusting piece of Chinese propaganda put out recently, where they showed Uyghur people dancing in a musical and saying stuff like, basically signaling that nothing is happening in Xinjiang or nothing is happening in occupied East Turkestan, and then showing that in an Australian press conference. Well, when it's under surveillance and supervision like that, they can't allow token minorities and voices to be heard, but only if it's under their dominance. So yeah, I feel it's their expansionist outlook on the world that is causing all these sort of problems, and his ambition Xi's ambition on top of this sort of lifelong term as the ruler of China, ruler of the People's Republic of China.
So is it possible, with the Chinese Communist Party having clear intentions to, well, kind of, as you say, Chinese imperialism, take over the South China Sea, take over Taiwan, the Communist Party felt like it had to get Hong Kong under control before it could successfully take on those challenges?
Yes, I think so. And they were on a roll as well, because they have to take, well, in my view, it almost feels like, this is the most optimistic way to look at a very bad situation, I feel. Xi and his party, and the party under his view, is a dying man making their last stand. They're now seeing this economic boom, prosperity, and really quick growth all across their economy before COVID, right? And they felt so powerful, and they also knew at the same time, I feel, that if they didn't use that power now, it's going to dissipate, because the labor force is going to shrink, and then the Chinese economy is not going to keep growing forever. So they either take these sort of shakier parts of their claimed sovereignty, like Hong Kong and Taiwan, when they have the chance, or they will never take it again. So they took this bet, they took this bet where they basically just put everything in, and they decided to take these places back before they don't have the power to anymore.
Well, wartime economy is one way to keep the economy going.
Well, I do think that it's interesting that the expansionism has gotten worse as the economy has slowed down inside China. Like, we've talked before about how they're using the Belt and Road essentially to export their excess capacity, right? Like, they have too many men without jobs. Like, if they send these factories overseas to Africa, to Central Asia, these places, they can kind of help their economy internally and kind of export that so they don't have to deal with the economic slowdown. And then I remember when we were talking with Nuri Turkel, some of the Uyghur activists who were saying, the Belt and Road has a lot to do with what's happening in Xinjiang, in East Turkestan, right? About how it's their way to kind of they need to control Xinjiang so that they can kind of get into Central Asia with the Belt and Road. And I feel like Hong Kong, one thing they definitely have is the financial thing, right? Like Hong Kong's financial institutions, the financial infrastructure that's there, being able to control that is a key part of also expanding.
Which is why the U.S. sanctions against all of those banks and, officials in Hong Kong is a very powerful way to challenge that. But it's interesting also how this sort of expansionist attitude undermines what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. At one point, it seemed like, at least in some parts of the segment of Taiwan, people were saying, yeah, maybe a one country, two systems thing with China is a good solution. But obviously, after everything that's happened in Hong Kong, that made it very clear to most people in Taiwan that kind of a peaceful resolution is not going to happen, which only leaves what the Chinese Communist Party has been promising all along, an invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah, and I really like the term that you used earlier. It's very much so a wartime economy that they're building. Their access to Africa as well, the alliance that they're building, friends that they're making along the way from the South China Sea and down into Africa. They're built, and that is something that the Western nations, or Australia, I would use this example again, that they're not quite catching up on, I feel.
Well, there's the potential for an almost unlimited expansion by the Communist Party. because 20 years ago, it would have seemed inconceivable that the Chinese military would be not only building out islands in the Spratlys in the South China Sea, but also militarizing them. Like that type of territorial expansion has just seemed inconceivable 2 decades ago. But if you look at like in the early 1400s, there was a famous Chinese admiral, Zheng He, who sailed these treasure ships all the way through the Indian Ocean and down the coast of Africa. And there's even monuments in many of these places set up by Chinese traders during that era, 600 years ago. Of course, that's not Chinese territory, right? But I can see a world in which a few decades from now, if unchecked, the Communist Party, feeling this need to further expand, will start saying, parts of Southeast Asia have always belonged to China. These parts, along trade routes in India have belonged to China. Sri Lanka, parts of the eastern coast of Africa have been part of China for 600 years. And so, again, it sounds crazy now, but it's not really outside of what the pattern we've seen over the last 2 decades of this just like pretty aggressive and largely unchecked expansion.
China has the dark side of the moon. It has Mars.
Yeah.
Since ancient times.
Well, the moon has been part of China since ancient times,
true.
right? I mean,
Chang'e
flew up there, and yeah, it's a solid claim, Chris.
And if we dared say anything in outer space as well, the national security law does have reach in outer space, I feel. I think. Yeah.
Wait, what? It has reach in outer space?
Yeah, I don't think there's a limit on its jurisdiction. Like you can say something in the US, in the UK, anywhere you are, any sovereignty, as long as it's against the party interest.
Yeah, like if we are critical of the Chinese Communist Party in the US and go to Hong Kong, we would still be at risk. So even if we go to the future Elon Musk moon base and say something against the Chinese Communist Party, we can't go to Hong Kong.
Well, just wait until they dig up like fragments of like an imperial palace under Elon Musk's moon base, and then they can claim Elon Musk's moon base.
Yeah. Well, if Elon Musk doesn't, change his tune on China quickly, he may end up cooperating with the Chinese, a totally private Chinese company to build, a Tesla moon base.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to Elon Musk is a smart guy, and he's making the same mistake everyone makes. To think that, we can trust China. We can trust private Chinese companies. Even we did an episode about this last week, about how there are even Taiwanese companies, semiconductor companies, doing business with Chinese companies, private companies, that are taking this technology and designing hypersonic missiles that could be used against Taiwan.
Yeah, and that is exactly the problem. The public here, we are in the free world. We need to realize one thing, which is we are already in the war, right? We say that we fear war with China, we fear a conflict with China. Is war with China inevitable? Well, it's already happening. It's a shadow war. It's just that we don't notice it, and it's happening under our feet. But it doesn't mean it's not there. And the numbers are not numbered in casualties, or are not tallied up in casualties or lives lost. It's in cases of East Turkestan it is, but it is seen in our price. In the price of our daily items, the numbers of factories and critical infrastructure and resources that China is buying up, it's being reflected in those reports. It's just that there are no active blood being shed on your soil doesn't mean there's no war happening. And this is something that we have to realize, and this is something that China realized more than anyone else. So we're still sort of stuck. Well, the public is still sort of stuck, I feel. In this Francis Fukuyama end of history sort of mindset, in that we just sort this out diplomatically. Well, maybe we can. Well, if we do this really right, if we do this right and we do this straight and we do this quick, maybe we can avoid a full-on hot war conflict, which nobody wants to see with China. But to reach that point, the first thing that we have to say to ourselves is that there is an active conflict going on. Just because we ignore it doesn't mean it's not happening. And we have to reflect it in our daily lives as well. We have to know what to invest in and what not, and we have to know what to support and what not to. That is the very basic entry level into living in our modern life. in the life in conflict with China, I feel.
Well, so that touches on a very important issue. How do we fight what you call Chinese imperialism, what I might call Chinese Communist Party imperialism?
Right, yeah. It's a very long and arduous process. It's persisted for thousands of years, and I don't see the Chinese Communist Party admitting to imperialism anytime soon. And it takes the recognition of the, like you guys said just now, the many intricacies and complexities and diversities within the Chinese culture, and not just homogenize everything into one single solid identity and expect that the entire nation has one opinion. Because it's worse enough, it's already bad enough that the Chinese Communist Party is doing this to their own people, forcing them to have one opinion. It's even worse when when the wider world as well is basically categorizing the entirety of a very large and diverse culture into one thing, and basically assuming that the entire entity has the same political opinion. It only leaves the people that wants to speak up with less choices, and it's forcing them into a more bubble. So I think we need more criticism, definitely, and we need to show. One thing which is really fake as well, but we need to show by sanctions and mainly sanctions. I feel that the Chinese Communist Party is not invulnerable. If you're a minority, if you are an interest group, if you're a stakeholder in China, or you're a stakeholder in the outlying parts of China, the sovereign outlying parts of China, like East Turkestan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Tibet. If you're in these areas that being active surveillance and oppression of the Chinese Communist Party, the free world needs to show these oppressed communities that the Chinese Communist Party is not invulnerable, and it does have its weak moments. And if we all just banded together, there is a chance of toppling this once and for all. So this is a really grand dream, and it does sound like I'm talking about a fairy tale now. But this sort of sentiment, right? This is something that the Chinese Communist Party is doing very well. They're crafting this fairy tale of a glorious new Chinese empire being built in the East and expanding its wings into the West, right? And this sort of stuff have captured the popular imagination. And even it sounds insane on paper and spoken out loud, it does have an effect. And there's no sort of popular imagination in what kind of world we could build without reliance on China. And that lack of imagination, where in a world where we can stop relying on China, is what we're fighting against. It's an ideological war. It's a war inside our heads right now.
So you're saying we need to kind of build that idea, like what would it mean to not support the Chinese Communist Party's oppression of other people?
What would decoupling look like?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, definitely we'll definitely need more dissent, like with great channels like yours and with many other medias. We'll continue building dissent. That's for sure. And on a government level, it means more sanctions, and it means targeted sanctions as well. Like the Magnitsky Act itself, it's a very good bill to put forward. But on top of that, it needs to be more wide scale, in where the first thing we do is to come from a place of power. Like the sanctions, if we continue to trade to China on one hand, and then on the other hand we sanction with them, or in one hand we do a sort of trades and interest, and then on the other hand we say that we're going to sanction on certain products. If this reliance continues and our industry is still depleting and still going away, and for that I mean the free world. If the free world is still exporting and losing most of the industry and bargaining power, our sanctions won't mean anything to China very soon, because they can sustain themselves, and they can build the things that they need, because they already have built a wartime economy, and by that it means they are now almost at a point of self-sufficiency. And when that happens, sanctions won't mean anything. So, in order for us to make our sanctions mean something, to make our words mean something, the free world must rebuild its own economy, I feel, before anything else, so that we come from a place of power, and then we can tell China that our trade does have an impact on your economy, despite what you like to think.
Yeah, we're in a very dangerous situation right now. Most of the U.S. medical equipment and medicine is made in China. What if one day China decides to sanction the U.S. and stop sending that stuff to us? We don't have the infrastructure to build it.
The U.S. is actually in an okay position, but like countries like Canada, Canada's having terrible trouble with the vaccine for coronavirus right now because they do not have the infrastructure to manufacture their own vaccine. So they can't vaccinate enough people. So like the U.S. is in a better position, but countries like Canada, Australia, like these like Western democracies that we need as allies to be able to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party, they rely a lot more on China than we do. So yeah, it's important to kind of like the Five Eyes shouldn't just be a national security alliance, right? Like we should be an economic alliance. Go ahead.
Like the Five Hands.
That just sounds weird.
It does sound weird. But like working together, holding hands, or at least fist bumping because it's, COVID.
There you go. Elbow bumping.
Oh, like we would call it the Five Hands instead of the Five Eyes.
Because we're working together in partnership on a wide range of things besides just security.
Max, you were going to say something?
Sums it up. Yeah, Five Hands.
Sure. Five Hands sums it up. Okay.
For sure, yes.
I mean, I do think that what you're saying, Max, about like now is the time to act is such an important point for people to understand because the Chinese Communist Party is actively building resilience to sanctions. Like they're actively trying to build a financial system where they don't have to be affected by sanctions. They don't have to rely on the US dollar. I mean, they're still years off from being able to build that fully, but they recognize what's happening and they're already starting. So
they are working towards the goal.
Oh yeah.
We are not.
Yeah, we do not believe that could ever happen, right? That, that they could build a second financial system that doesn't rely on the dollar.
Most people don't know we're in a war with China.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We can, a lot of the times when we go into topics like this, does it mean like stop buying certain products from certain brands? Of course it does. But then most of the burden is then slanted off to the little guy and onto us normal civilian citizens. Stuff like this like tectonic movements like this have to be led by the government and the elected members of parliament. This cannot be done from a down to top level, or that only works when it's dissent and when it's opinion. And when we're trying to get certain opinions through. But when it comes to large scale acts like this, we can tell people to stop buying from Chinese Communist Party owned firms and factories. But then what alternative does that leave them? Nothing, right? And even if they wanted to support their own local industries, maybe it's unaffordable, and maybe it's not the brand recognitions and the market isn't as the supply chains there aren't as sophisticated or aren't as matured as as trading with China. That's just more convenient, just to buy things ready-made from China. So it means on the policy level, there needs to be more sort of a top-down approach when it comes to bringing industry back. And there really is no bargaining on that. Call it a wartime economy, call it self-sufficiency, call it what we want. But in order to bargain at all, we need the bargaining chips. And it comes from the government. And we need to see them act now.
Well, it comes from the people pressuring their governments to do something.
Well, yeah, of course as well. But because the only reason why I say that is because a lot of the boycott campaigns, I've seen too many boycott campaigns being brought up on the internet. And in Hong Kong as well, we had our fair share of boycott campaigns. But sometimes we just feel powerless because we know that changing our daily routine, just the 1,000 or just the 1,000 of us won't really change much. And especially when public opinion isn't aware of the fact that we are in a war with China yet, it's really hard to mobilize like over 50% of the public masses to not buy China or not buy Chinese-made goods or Chinese Communist Party-made goods. So yeah, the boycott campaigns it really does feel a bit lacking still.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about that kind of power, when it's concentrated as political power towards, like you said, Chris, towards the elected representatives of your country, because we've seen it's taken the U.S. government and the Commerce Department like outright banning U.S. companies from selling certain sensitive technology to companies affiliated with the Chinese military to actually get that to stop, right? It took the Trump administration, like the Biden administration just stopped us from selling semiconductors to 7 Chinese companies. The Trump administration stopped several Chinese companies linked to the U.S. military from trading on the New York Stock Exchange. But if the U.S. government hadn't stepped in on national security grounds, that would still be happening.
U.S. companies would be partnering with private Chinese companies, quote unquote, even though these private companies are like run by generals in the People's Liberation Army.
Former generals.
But Chris, there's money to be made. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors to make as much money as possible.
Until a hypersonic missile blows up in your face.
Yeah. And it's happening in Australia as well. The Australian Defence Force has a lot of data stored in a Chinese-owned company in an offshore database. And that still baffles me till this day. Like, how this sort of sensitive information, how do we let a hostile or potentially hostile geopolitical power take control of this sensitive information? It's gone past the point where we're supposed to be cautious, right? Because most of the public, they're cautious about certain regimes. So they squirm when it comes to North Korea, and in other sorts of conflicts around the world, they have their own sort of stance on it, which is good, which is needed to have an opinion. And but it almost seems like there's this eerie coincidence where people just collectively lose an opinion when it comes to China. Like, I know, but China, right? We always hear that a lot. No matter how political they are, or no matter how many views on human rights or on the building of domestic economies that they have, and when it comes to China, they just collectively stop talking, and they collectively lose the ability to debate or to converse and build up rhetoric. So that also has to do with Chinese agent networks, infiltration networks overseas, I feel, because it is more so than just economy. Because when it comes to China, there is an actual threat, I feel, to your family and to yourself. When it's run like a triad, there's a lot more to fear than just losing a couple of bucks. So I'm not saying that the Chinese Communist Party actively threatens everyone that dissents against them, but definitely the atmosphere of fear that they have conducted and that they have orchestrated over the free world is taken quite effectively, I think.
Yeah, I think like in 10 years, people are going to look back and be like, how could we be so stupid when dealing with the Chinese Communist Party? I'm just kidding. In 10 years, we'll all be wishing glorious Chairman Xi Jinping a happy birthday. Well, Max, thanks for joining us today. If somebody listening wanted to learn more about you or what you're doing, where should they go?
You can follow me on Twitter. It's Max Mok Chito. That is MaxMokChito. Or you can get me on. You can follow me on Instagram. It's MokChimax, and those are the two most active accounts that I hold right now. And I'll be posting my activities in Australia and abroad on there quite regularly.
And where can we learn more about Hongkonger protection against Chinese expansion?
Right, yes. We've got a Facebook page and an Instagram page. On Instagram, it's HK Pace Official. And on Facebook, it's just our full name spelled. We didn't have time to talk about this today, but we started this Hong Kong Diaspora organization in Australia to band together the collective power of the Hong Kong diaspora, Hong Kongers from all different of ethnicities and cultures, to show that Hong Kong does not belong to China. Hong Kong is its own separate identity, and we are as diverse as a multicultural society, as any multicultural society out there. And that is the furthest thing away from China. That is multicultural.
All right, thanks. I'll put links to those in the description below. Max, thanks again. It's been great to have you on.
Thank you.
Well, so the lesson I took away from all of that is that even though things are very, very bad in Hong Kong, they can still get worse.
I kept thinking when Max was talking about the whole, the Chinese imperialism thing and all of this stuff, like people not realizing what's happening. I kept thinking about that quote from The Usual Suspects, where, I'm talking about Kevin Spacey's character.
Kaiser Sose.
He's like talking in the beginning.
No, don't spoil it, Matt.
Oh,
Oops.
We're gonna
That 30-year-old movie.
We're gonna talk. The whole quote about how like the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Oh yeah, wasn't that from a Twilight Zone originally?
Maybe,
something?
yeah. Well, I mean, I only saw it in The Usual Suspects. So
Okay. Well, so what do you mean by that?
Well, the whole idea that we're at war with the Chinese Communist Party, they can just hide it, right? Like they're doing all this stuff to wage economic warfare, political warfare, all these things that we've been talking about for the last 8 years. And they're able to, at the same time, hide it. That it doesn't happen. It's not convince us it's not happening, and also somehow trigger a Pavlovian response in governments and media around the world to be afraid of angering China in case we get into a war. You know what I mean? Like the whole like
weird,
angering
yeah.
China thing, where like, oh well, we can't like increase tensions.
Like, what would happen? What horrible, like, what are they imagining would happen?
Maybe they would,
Get kicked out of China? Their little businesses or their little newspapers and media companies get kicked out of China?
Yeah, that would never happen if we didn't make China mad. It's not like the New York Times isn't already kicked out of China.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I mean, like NBC has their Olympic broadcast contract. They have an interest in maintaining, their relationship. So there's
all the sports teams.
There's a lot of, major U.S. companies that have these extremely strong, just like, Major League Baseball, right? I mean, they want to boycott Georgia because of the voting law, but like they're happy to have, set up shop with the MLB in China.
Or this whole like, literally the NBA had a basketball training camp in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should boycott that because, the people in Xinjiang, aren't even allowed to vote if they show ID.
I think
just like Major League Baseball, you knocked that one right out of the ballpark.
The thing about it almost feels, I was going to say this sounds terrible, but it almost feels like what needs to happen is some, like somebody who's like a high-ranking Wall Street official needs to get arrested in China.
Like just flat out arrested and tortured.
But at the same time, now I'm thinking maybe that wouldn't make any difference because that happened with an Australian, Stern Hu.
From Rio Tinto. Yeah.
Like back in the mid-2000s.
But the difference is, and this is horrible that this is the difference, but he was ethnically Chinese. And so like the sad truth is people just don't care as much, even though he was an Australian citizen. They're just like, oh, well, maybe like that's kind of okay-ish. Which it's not. And I think what we've seen with Canada and the Communist Party's detention and then later official arrest and charges against the two Michaels, right? Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. It's like, these are Canadians, but they're also white Canadians, so they look Canadian. And I think the issue now has become a much broader part of the public consciousness in Canada.
But it doesn't stop Canada from doing business with China. I mean, I'm not advocating for somebody to get arrested. I'm just saying.
But that's unfortunately
it's kind of like the thing we were talking about where like if it doesn't happen to you, you don't think it's going to happen ever, Yeah.
Don't worry. If a Wall Street executive is ever arrested in China, we'll be sure to make an episode about that and, call for his or her release. So
yeah,
we got their back.
I think that like it kind of doesn't matter anymore. Before, I thought that, if you were not Chinese, you would be safer in China.
It was true for a period of time, and now we're in this kind of area where it might not be so true anymore.
No, I don't think it's true anymore at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I definitely felt safe as a white person in China, in mainland, last time I was there. But it's just, but that was many years ago.
The U.S. State Department warned against travel in China, partially for coronavirus and partially because of politically motivated detentions. I believe that's still the case I don't think they've removed that.
No, I don't
Right.
think so. Now you did they add possibility of getting anal swab to that travel warning?
Well, I mean, that's a pro, depending on how you.
Okay, we should.
No, but the point is that like you can be arrested arbitrarily, and because of the way Chinese laws are written, they can actually detain you first and then decide later what the charges are going to be. Like there's no like you don't have to have committed a crime first. They can always figure that out later.
Yeah, after they've tortured you to
And get you
get
to
some kind
confess.
of confession from you, then they can make it up.
And if you don't confess, they'll do what they've done to some people is they basically take their denial of things, but like edit it together in a video as if it's a confession to something.
Or they'll drug you into a confession, as like they drugged Peter Humphrey.
Right.
I mean,
Well, no,
it's-
but I'm talking about Peter Humphrey because like he never actually confessed to things, but they selectively edited that and then made it seem as if he was confessing, which he is adamant that he did not.
And this all of these things have already happened. We're getting to the point where the Chinese Communist Party will be able to act with impunity if we don't stop them now. We're losing our ability to stop the Communist Party.
and they're going to be able to act with impunity, not just within China's borders, which is the current
Mhm.
case, but around the world, places where the Belt and Road are. Like,
They're already doing it in many of these developing countries, acting with impunity, even though it's upsetting, like Cambodia,
all right, I was just thinking about that.
right? Like
yeah.
like the Communist Party is like gambling, for example, is illegal in Cambodia for Cambodians, but like because of collusion with the Cambodian president, they've set up like a whole like gambling town in Sihanoukville, and we did an episode about that on China Uncensored, where like they're bringing all these Chinese people and Chinese money and Chinese things, and then like it's having a huge negative impact on
Isn't it
the
essentially
locals.
run by the Chinese mafia
Oh yeah,
at this point?
yeah. No, I mean the mafia. I mean it's a totally private mafia.
Ah,
Ask
Right.
Hongkongers about that. They
Yeah.
talked about how the triads are connected to
all
the party.
connected.
Yeah, I mean, and we haven't talked a whole lot about that on our show, but like a lot of the times, the Communist Party will conduct its operations not just through private companies, but actually through triads and other
The underworld.
underworld type criminal organizations that are also carrying out the party's agenda. But I think that makes sense because the China was taken over by a group of gangsters in 1949. So like it's essentially that same idea, that same mentality that's permeated that whole time. So it's actually probably easier to work with gangsters than to work with companies.
Well, what's the difference? But
Ooh.
yeah. Well, Matt, China has never invaded another country.
The
Did you
first
know-
thing they did was invade Tibet.
No.
Then they tried to invade Taiwan, but the U.S. stopped them.
Oh, you're talking about no. They've never Tibet was part of China. China, I'm not in 5,000 years of history. They've never invaded. Seriously, that was actually something Hua Chunying said recently at a press conference. So they do this like whitewashing of Chinese history that's not at all accurate.
It would be great if she's saying that and just like, well, I guess it's in China. It's not in front of Western reporters, so it wouldn't happen. But I'm just imagining like a wave of all the reporters just tackling her. I know. We're done. But we're already seeing China trying its hand at sanctioning the Western world with H&M and Nike. All these Western brands that try to, say we're not going to use Xinjiang slave labor cotton.
Yeah, I mean, they've also sanctioned like
The
professors,
EU officials as
and
well.
EU officials and professors at
They're trying their hand out at it. And they're going to get to the point where Chinese sanctions could really hurt the West. Think about that.
But the advantage of that is, you mentioned earlier, like we don't see the problem until it happens to us. And so as the Communist Party starts to do these revenge sanctions against Westerners, Western elected officials, and Western companies, then like people in the West are like, wait a second, maybe this does affect us. Maybe the Chinese Communist Party really is this evil mafia-like organization that's
if only
destroying
there
us.
had been some show trying to warn us for a decade.
No, I think that they really. I mean, I think I welcome them doing this because it's great. You don't have to kind of look for examples of it happening.
It's honestly way more effective than China Uncensored.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but like the whole like economic, like the whole like letting Australian lobsters die on the crates, on like it's just like
their economic warfare.
Yeah,
against
I mean,
Australia.
but even Max was saying that even with all that, there's still
Look at the coronavirus.
Yeah.
I mean, how did they spin that to their advantage?
Chris, we need China's help to deal with the coronavirus. We need to follow their methods and we need to get their vaccine.
You can't even talk about that the virus came from China.
I think, though, that they maybe have overstepped in that. 6 months ago, the idea that it may have come from a Chinese lab was not anything that you could talk about without being considered a conspiracy theorist, crazy person. But now we have open letters being published in the New York Times with people saying we need an investigation into the origins of this and whether it came from a lab.
Yeah, to be clear, the issue is whether it accidentally leaked from a Chinese lab.
Not with some kind of bioweapon.
Right. And there's very few people saying that, but definitely the lab leak hypothesis.
It was still treated like a crazy person thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, as I've long said, these kind of accidents can happen all the time when you have lax safety standards and lax enforcement. And we've seen them happen before in China with other things, so like SARS. So like, it's just not that far out of the realm of possibility that, people just made a mistake. And, as I always say, never underestimate the power of human incompetence.
Well, I mean, take a look at who was arguing against the lab leak hypothesis at the beginning, like WHO experts like Peter Daszak, who turns out to have close working relationships with the lab that may have leaked the virus.
Just wait till the Chinese Communist Party, sanctions him over something, and then
he already
changes tune.
I mean, I think it took a year of the Chinese Communist Party trying to convince people that it came from all these other countries, and also maybe like frozen food or German auto parts. Like they had to or the U.S. military. Like it kept kind of having to get bigger, and then they kept having to, and then the whole like restricting the WHO report and this. So they had to. It took like a year of them doing all of this stuff before people were able to publicly say things like,
"Wait a minute,
yes, there's
what
something
if they're
weird."
lying?
Yeah. So I mean. We have to keep up the pressure, and then we have to like let the Communist Party keep making that mistake.
Yeah, and it requires people to be educated to know what's happening and make a big stint about it. If the public fully understands what's happening with China, none of this would be tolerated.
Yeah. So the real solution is continue to listen to China Unscripted and watch China Uncensored.
And America Uncovered while you're at it.
You're welcome.
Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganezda.
We'll see you on all of our other shows.
And this one.